Sarah Mitchell settled into seat 14C with her romance novel as Flight 447 from Denver to Chicago prepared for takeoff. But 30 minutes into the smooth flight, the Boeing 737 suddenly lurched violently to the left, throwing passengers against their seats while oxygen masks dropped from overhead compartments and the cabin lights flickered ominously as panicked screams filled the air. But what terrified Sarah most was the captain's voice crackling through the intercom asking if there were any military pilots aboard because something was very, very wrong with the aircraft. The elderly man in 14B grabbed Sarah's arm with trembling fingers, his face pale as death, while the young mother across the aisle clutched her crying infant to her chest, and Sarah could hear the flight attendants trying to maintain calm in their voices as they moved through the cabin checking on passengers, but their eyes betrayed the fear they were desperately trying to hide, and Sarah felt her military training kick in as she assessed the situation, noting the way the plane was listing to one side and the unusual vibrations coming through the floor that suggested something catastrophic had happened to the aircraft systems. Through her window, Sarah could see they were flying much lower than normal, and the landscape below was rushing past at an alarming speed, while dark storm clouds gathered on the horizon like an approaching army, and she realized with growing dread that the captain had not repeated his request for military pilots, which could only mean one of two things. Either no one had responded, or the situation had deteriorated so rapidly that there was no time for proper introductions and briefings. The businessman in the row ahead was frantically trying to call his wife on his cell phone, despite the flight attendant's repeated announcements that all electronic devices needed to remain off, and Sarah could hear fragments of his desperate whispered conversation as he told someone he loved them, and that he was sorry for working so many late nights and missing so many dinners and birthdays and school plays, and the raw emotion in his voice made Sarah's chest tighten because she recognized the sound of a man who believed he was about to die. A flight attendant named Jessica, according to her name tag, approached Sarah's row with a forced smile that didn't reach her eyes and asked if everyone was comfortable. But Sarah could see the woman was checking each passenger carefully as if memorizing their faces, and when their eyes met, Sarah saw something flicker in Jessica's expression, a moment of recognition, or perhaps hope that made Sarah wonder if her military bearing was more obvious than she had thought. Aircraft shuddered again, more violently this time, and Sarah heard what sounded like metal grinding against metal somewhere deep in the belly of the plane, while the lights dimmed and brightened in an irregular pattern that reminded her of the electrical failures she had witnessed during her combat missions overseas. And she found herself automatically cataloging the sounds and sensations the way she had been trained to do when flying damaged aircraft back to base under enemy fire behind her. A teenage girl was sobbing uncontrollably, while her father tried to comfort her with words that sounded hollow even to Sarah. And she could hear him promising that everything would be fine, that the pilots knew what they were doing, that modern aircraft were built to handle emergencies, but his voice cracked on the word emergencies, and Sarah knew he was trying to convince himself as much as his daughter. The intercom crackled to life again, and this time the captain's voice was strained and urgent as he announced they were experiencing technical difficulties and would be making an unscheduled landing at the nearest available airport. But he did not say when or where, and Sarah noticed he avoided using the word emergency, even though everyone on board knew that was exactly what this was, and she wondered how bad things really were in the cockpit and whether the crew was following standard protocols or improvising, because their situation had moved beyond anything covered in their training manuals. Sarah closed her romance novel and slipped it into the seat pocket in front of her, knowing somehow that the fictional world of happy endings and perfect love stories seemed absurdly trivial compared to the very real drama unfolding around her, and she found herself thinking about her own life and the choices that had led her to this moment sitting in seat 14C on a Tuesday afternoon when she should have been safely on the ground preparing for her next assignment. The Plane banked sharply to the right, and Sarah felt her stomach drop as they seemed to lose altitude rapidly, while the engines made a sound she had never heard before. A high-pitched whining that suggested they were being pushed beyond their normal operating parameters, and she realized with crystal clarity that whatever was happening to Flight 447 was far more serious than a simple technical malfunction, and that the next few minutes would determine whether she and the other 179 souls aboard this aircraft would live to see another day through the chaos and fear. Sarah heard the captain make his announcement again, asking for any military pilots to identify themselves to the flight crew, and this time his voice carried a note of desperation that made her blood run cold because she knew that commercial airline captains were trained to handle virtually any emergency, and if this one was asking for help from passengers, then they were facing something truly catastrophic. And as she unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up, Sarah realized that her carefully planned escape from her military past was about to collide head-on with a present that demanded every skill she had spent years trying to forget. Captain Rodriguez gripped the controls as his co-pilot slumped unconscious from what appeared to be a sudden medical emergency, while multiple warning lights flashed across the instrument panel indicating hydraulic failure and engine trouble. But when Sarah heard the desperate announcement, she closed her book and walked to the front of the plane, revealing she was Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell, a decorated F-16 pilot on leave who had been trying to forget the horrors of her last combat mission, but now found herself face to face with a different kind of life-or-death situation. As the captain explained, they were losing altitude rapidly, and air traffic control had just informed them that severe weather was closing in on all nearby airports. Sarah pushed through the narrow aisle past frightened passengers who reached out to touch her as if her military bearing could somehow transfer safety to them. And she noticed how the aircraft was vibrating in a way that reminded her of the damaged fighter jets she had nursed back to base during her 3 tours overseas. But this was different, because a commercial airliner was not built to absorb battle damage and keep flying, and as she approached the cockpit door, she could hear Captain Rodriguez speaking rapidly into his headset using aviation terminology that would have been gibberish to most passengers, but to Sarah sounded like a pilot reporting multiple system failures to air traffic control. The flight attendant Jessica unlocked the cockpit door with shaking hands, and Sarah stepped into the cramped space where she immediately assessed the situation with the cold efficiency that had kept her alive through countless combat missions, and she could see that First Officer Williams was not just unconscious, but appeared to be in cardiac arrest based on his blue-tinged lips and the way his chest barely rose and fell, while Captain Rodriguez was simultaneously trying to fly the plane monitor his co-pilot's condition and communicate with ground control, which was an impossible task for any single person. No matter how experienced, Sarah introduced herself to Captain Rodriguez, who looked at her with a mixture of relief and skepticism, because while he desperately needed help, he had never worked with a fighter pilot before, and the skills required to fly a single-seat military aircraft were vastly different from managing a commercial airliner full of civilians. But when Sarah began reading the instrument panel aloud and correctly identifying each warning light and system failure, his expression changed to one of cautious hope mixed with the grim realization that their situation was even worse than he had initially thought. The hydraulic system was completely compromised, which meant they had lost power steering and would have to rely on manual controls that required enormous physical strength to operate while the left engine was running rough and showing signs of imminent failure, and the electrical system was fluctuating in a way that suggested they might lose all power at any moment, and Sarah realized with growing alarm that they were essentially flying a damaged aircraft with backup systems that were themselves beginning to fail. Captain Rodriguez explained that they had been cruising at 37,000 feet when First Officer Williams suddenly grabbed his chest and collapsed, while simultaneously multiple warning alarms began sounding and the aircraft started losing altitude and hydraulic pressure. and he had immediately declared an emergency and requested vectors to the nearest airport. But air traffic control had just informed him that a massive storm system was moving across the entire region, and visibility was dropping to near zero at every airport within their fuel range. Sarah looked at the fuel gauge and felt her heart sink because they had perhaps 40 minutes of flying time remaining, which under normal circumstances would be more than enough to reach an airport, but with their current rate of fuel consumption due to the engine problems and the need to maintain power to the remaining systems they were looking at, maybe 25 minutes before they would be forced to attempt a landing regardless of conditions or airport availability. The radio crackled with urgent communications from air traffic control, who were working frantically to clear airspace and coordinate emergency response teams. But Sarah could hear the strain in the controller's voice as he reported that the storm was intensifying faster than predicted, and winds at their primary alternate airport were now gusting to 60 knots with heavy snow and freezing rain that would make any landing attempt extremely hazardous. Even for an aircraft with fully functioning systems, Captain Rodriguez tried to revive First Officer Williams using the emergency medical kit, but it was clear that the man needed immediate hospital care that was impossible to provide at 30,000 feet, and Sarah found herself thinking about the cruel irony that she had survived multiple combat missions in hostile territory, only to face potential death while traveling as a passenger on what should have been a routine domestic flight. The aircraft lurched suddenly as they hit severe turbulence, and Sarah grabbed the back of the pilot's seat to steady herself while watching Captain Rodriguez fight to maintain control using only manual inputs. Because the autopilot had disengaged when the hydraulic system failed, and she could see the physical strain on his face as he wrestled with controls that normally required only light touches, but now demanded constant muscle power to keep the aircraft level. Sarah realized that Captain Rodriguez was an experienced commercial pilot, but he had never trained for this specific combination of emergencies, and while he was doing everything correctly according to his training, the situation was rapidly moving beyond the scope of standard emergency procedures and into the realm of test pilot skills and combat experience, where split-second decisions and unconventional solutions could mean the difference between survival and catastrophe. Weather radar showed a solid wall of red and purple indicating severe thunderstorms directly ahead, while their current heading would take them into the heart of the storm system, and Captain Rodriguez was faced with the impossible choice of flying through dangerous weather with a crippled aircraft or attempting to divert around the storms, which would consume precious fuel. They could not afford to waste. Air traffic control came back on the radio with news that made Sarah's blood run cold, because they reported that their primary destination airport had just closed due to a ground stop caused by severe icing conditions, and their alternate airport was reporting winds beyond the safe landing limits for commercial aircraft, which meant they were running out of options as quickly as they were running out of fuel and time. Sarah looked at the unconscious First Officer Williams and then at Captain Rodriguez, who was clearly reaching the limits of his physical and mental endurance. And she realized that whether she wanted it or not, her military training and combat experience were about to be put to the ultimate test, because the lives of everyone aboard Flight 447 now depended on skills she had spent months trying to forget, and decisions she would have to make in the next few minutes that would determine whether they lived or died. Sarah slipped into the co-pilot's seat and immediately recognized the catastrophic nature of their situation as the aircraft shuddered through turbulence while she worked frantically to stabilize their descent, using her military training to compensate for the failing systems. But when she looked at the fuel gauge, her blood ran cold because they had barely enough fuel for one landing attempt, and the nearest airport was reporting zero visibility due to a sudden blizzard, while the unconscious co-pilot began showing signs of what appeared to be a heart attack, and the captain confessed he had never attempted a manual landing in conditions this severe, which meant their fate now rested entirely in Sarah's hands, as she realized the very skills she had been trying to escape might be the only thing standing between 180 passengers and certain death. Sarah quickly familiarized herself with the Boeing 737's control layout, which was vastly different from the F-16 cockpit she knew by heart. But her years of cross-training on various military aircraft helped her adapt as she began calling out instrument readings to Captain Rodriguez while simultaneously calculating their glide ratio and fuel consumption rate in her head, the way she had done countless times when nursing damaged fighters back to base under enemy fire, and she realized they were in a controlled emergency descent that was rapidly becoming uncontrolled as the remaining hydraulic pressure continued to drop. The radio erupted with chatter from air traffic control, who were coordinating with emergency response teams at 3 different airports, while trying to find them a safe place to land. But every report was worse than the last, with visibility dropping to 0 at their primary destination and crosswinds exceeding safe limits at their alternates. And Sarah could hear the frustration in the controller's voice as he tried to work miracles that simply were not available in the current weather conditions. Captain Rodriguez was fighting to maintain level flight as the aircraft wanted to roll left due to the asymmetric thrust from the failing engine, and Sarah could see the physical toll this was taking on him as sweat poured down his face despite the cool cockpit temperature, and his arms shook from the constant pressure required to keep the heavy aircraft under control. Without power assist, and she knew he could not maintain this level of exertion much longer. Sarah took over the radio communications to free Captain Rodriguez to focus entirely on flying, and she began speaking directly to air traffic control, using the precise military terminology that cut through confusion and conveyed critical information efficiently, and when the controller heard her crisp professional delivery, he immediately understood he was now dealing with someone who had experience in life-or-death aviation emergencies. The weather radar showed they were flying directly into the teeth of a massive storm system that stretched for hundreds of miles in every direction, and Sarah realized they had no choice but to penetrate the storm because they lacked the fuel to fly around it. And she began calculating the least dangerous path through the turbulence, using techniques she had learned flying through sandstorms and enemy air defenses in combat zones, where deviation from course meant death. First Officer Williams suddenly went into cardiac arrest, and his body convulsed violently in his seat, while Sarah tried to perform CPR in the cramped cockpit space. But she quickly realized that keeping him alive was secondary to keeping the aircraft flying, and she made the brutal decision to focus on the controls, while Captain Rodriguez continued chest compressions between his flying duties. And she felt the familiar weight of command decisions, where saving some lives meant accepting that others might be lost. The left engine began making grinding noises that Sarah recognized from her combat experience as the sound of metal components destroying themselves under stress, and she knew they had perhaps minutes before. Complete engine failure, which would leave them flying on a single engine with no hydraulic assistance and minimal electrical power. And she began mentally rehearsing single-engine approach procedures while calculating whether they had enough altitude and airspeed to reach any airport. Air traffic control came back with devastating news that their primary destination had just declared an emergency closure due to a fuel truck that had skidded off the icy runway and blocked the only available landing strip, while their first alternate was reporting wind shear conditions that had already caused 2 aircraft to execute missed approaches, and their second alternate was beyond their fuel range, which meant they were rapidly running out of options. Sarah looked at the fuel quantity and realized they were now committed to whatever airport they chose, because they would not have enough fuel for a second approach if the first attempt failed, and she began studying the approach charts for the nearest airport, while calculating the minimum fuel required for a single engine approach in severe weather conditions, and the numbers were not encouraging. The aircraft suddenly dropped 500 feet as they hit severe downdrafts, and Sarah felt her stomach lurch as she fought to help Captain Rodriguez regain control, while passengers screamed in the cabin behind them, and she could hear flight attendants trying to maintain calm over the intercom. But their voices betrayed the terror they were feeling as the aircraft bucked and rolled through the turbulent air. Captain Rodriguez was reaching the point of physical exhaustion, and Sarah could see his hands beginning to shake as he fought the controls. And she realized she would soon need to take over primary flight duties even though she had never flown a commercial airliner before. And the thought of being responsible for 180 civilian lives in an aircraft she barely understood filled her with a dread she had never experienced even in combat. The radio crackled with an emergency transmission from air traffic control, reporting that a small regional airport about 30 miles ahead had just opened a single runway after emergency crews cleared ice and snow. But the controller warned that visibility was still near zero, and they had no instrument landing system, which meant any approach would have to be visual in conditions where visual flight was nearly impossible. Sarah studied the approach chart for the regional airport and realized it was their only hope even though the runway was shorter than ideal for a Boeing 737 and surrounded by hills that would make the approach extremely dangerous in good weather, let alone in a blizzard with a crippled aircraft, and she began calculating approach speeds and landing distances while praying that her combat experience flying damaged aircraft into primitive airstrips would somehow translate to this civilian emergency. The left engine finally failed completely with a loud bang that shook the entire aircraft, and Sarah watched the engine fire warning light illuminate as Captain Rodriguez immediately began the engine fire checklist while she took over primary flight controls and felt the aircraft yaw violently to the right as the asymmetric thrust tried to spin them into an unrecoverable spiral, and she applied full rudder and aileron to maintain control while realizing they were now flying a single-engine approach in a blizzard to a short runway with no margin for error and no second chances. With her hands steady on the controls despite the chaos around her, Sarah guided the crippled aircraft through the blinding snow, using only instruments and her combat instincts, while emergency vehicles raced across the runway below and passengers prayed in multiple languages. But as they approached the runway, she discovered the landing gear was only partially deployed, and she had to make a split-second decision between attempting a belly landing or trying to manually force the gear down, knowing that either choice could result in catastrophe. But in that moment, she thought of every person behind her counting on her training, and she made her choice executing a textbook emergency landing that brought the aircraft to a grinding halt just 50 feet from the end of the runway. And as the passengers erupted in cheers and tears, Sarah finally understood that sometimes running from your past means missing the chance to save the future. Sarah felt the aircraft shudder as she reduced power on the remaining engine and began the final approach to the small regional airport whose runway lights were barely visible through the swirling snow, and she could hear Captain Rodriguez calling out altitudes and airspeeds while she fought to maintain the precise glide path that would bring them safely to the ground. But the crosswinds were gusting unpredictably and threatening to push them off course into the hills that surrounded the airport on three sides. The landing gear warning horn blared continuously as Sarah tried to lower the gear using the manual backup system, but only the nose gear and right main gear extended while the left main gear remained stubbornly retracted despite her repeated attempts to cycle the system, and she realized they would have to land with asymmetric gear, which would cause the aircraft to veer violently to the left the moment they touched down. Air traffic control was providing constant updates on wind conditions and runway status, while emergency crews positioned themselves along the runway with foam trucks and ambulances. But Sarah could hear the tension in the controller's voice as he reported that visibility was dropping even further, and they were now operating at the absolute minimum conditions for any aircraft operation, let alone an emergency landing by a damaged airliner. Captain Rodriguez was monitoring their fuel state and announced they had less than 5 minutes of fuel remaining, which meant Sarah had exactly one chance to get this approach right, because there would be no fuel for a missed approach or go around, and she felt the familiar calm that had always descended on her during combat missions when the situation became so desperate that fear transformed into crystalline focus. The aircraft bucked and rolled as they descended through the turbulent air, and Sarah could feel the passengers behind her holding their breath as she made constant control inputs to keep them aligned with the runway center line while fighting the asymmetric thrust from the single engine and the drag from the partially extended landing gear that was trying to pull them into a spin. Sarah began the final approach checklist from memory, while Captain Rodriguez monitored their descent rate and called out decision points, and she realized that everything she had learned about flying damaged aircraft in combat was now being tested in a way she had never imagined, because military aircraft were designed to absorb battle damage, while commercial airliners were built for efficiency and comfort, not survival in extreme conditions. The runway lights suddenly appeared through the snow like a string of pearls, and Sarah felt a surge of hope as she aligned the aircraft with the center line. But the crosswinds immediately tried to push them sideways, and she had to apply aggressive rudder inputs to maintain heading while simultaneously adjusting power and pitch to control their descent. Rate First Officer Williams had been unconscious for nearly 20 minutes, and Sarah could see that Captain Rodriguez was exhausted from the physical demands of manual flight control, but there was no time to rest because they were now committed to landing, and any mistake in the next 60 seconds would likely be fatal for everyone aboard. The aircraft touched down hard on the right main gear and nose gear, while the left side of the fuselage scraped along the runway in a shower of sparks, and Sarah immediately applied maximum braking on the right side while using rudder and reverse thrust to keep them from veering off the runway into the snow-covered grass that would have meant certain disaster. The grinding sound of metal on concrete filled the cockpit as they slid down the runway, with Sarah fighting to maintain directional control while the aircraft wanted to spin to the left due to the asymmetric braking, and she could see the end of the runway approaching rapidly and realized they were not going to stop in time unless she did something drastic. Sarah made the split-second decision to steer the aircraft toward a snowbank at the end of the runway rather than risk going off the side into the trees, and she felt the nose gear collapse as they plowed into the soft snow, which brought them to an abrupt stop that threw everyone forward against their restraints, but kept the aircraft upright and intact. The cabin erupted in cheers and applause as passengers realized they were alive and on the ground, while flight attendants immediately began evacuating everyone through the emergency exits onto the snow-covered runway where emergency crews were waiting with blankets and medical attention. And Sarah sat in the pilot's seat for a moment, feeling the adrenaline drain from her system as she realized what they had just accomplished. Captain Rodriguez reached over and shook her hand with tears in his eyes as he thanked her for saving everyone aboard, while paramedics rushed into the cockpit to attend to First Officer Williams, who was showing signs of regaining consciousness, and Sarah felt a profound sense of completion as she realized that her military training had found its ultimate purpose in saving civilian lives. As Sarah walked through the cabin checking on passengers, she was overwhelmed by their gratitude, and she realized that the nightmares and guilt she had been carrying from her combat missions were beginning to fade because she had used her skills to preserve life rather than take it. And the elderly man from seat 14B grabbed her hand and told her she was an angel, sent by God. The young mother with the infant pressed a photo into Sarah's hand showing her family and whispered that her daughter would grow up knowing that a brave woman had saved her life. And Sarah felt tears streaming down her face as she understood that sometimes the most important battles are fought not against enemies but against the circumstances that threaten innocent people. Emergency crews helped everyone off the aircraft and into heated buses that would take them to the terminal where they would wait for another flight to complete their journeys. But Sarah knew that for her, this was not just the end of a harrowing flight, but the beginning of a new understanding of what it meant to serve others, and she realized that running from her past had only delayed her from discovering her true calling, which was to use her unique skills to protect and save lives whenever the opportunity arose.